Okay, so good morning, everybody. For today's lecture, Modern Western Literature, I'm going to have a presentation for you guys, and my topic is Obsession of Time in Romanticism Era and Modernism Era, which is presented by Xinyi Huang, which is my name. Hello, everybody. So let's quickly move on to what we're going to talk about today, which is the concept. I'm going to talk about two main ideas, Romanticism and modernism. And I'm going to talk about both of their background and the connection to both two of the famous writers. For Romanticism, I'm going to talk about William Wordsworth and George Gordon Byron. And for modernism, I'm going to talk about T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevenson. So, next page, Romanticism era of literature. The key point is Romanticism is basically a broad idea, and it's a literacy movement spanning roughly from 1790s to 1850s. The movement was characterized by a celebration of the idea of nature. So basically, according to the famous writers from their writings, you can get that most of them are having a connection with the idea of nature, and they use a lot of metaphors to describe their feelings, having a connection with nature. And it's also an idea of absolute, the commons man, and focusing on individual experience and idealizations of women and imbalance of isolations and melancholy. And some of the famous romantic writers are included as William Wordsworth, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and George Gordon Byron, which I'm going to talk about two of them today. So next page. William Wordsworth, he's born in 1770s to 1850s. William Wordsworth is one of the founders and the leaders of English Romanticism, and also one of the central figures of important intellect, a poet that connects human relationship to nature of using vocabularies and speeches patterns of common people in poetry, and the idea of nature by using metaphors. So in his writing, you can saw a lot of examples that he used the idea of metaphor to connect his humans' feelings to nature. William Wordsworth is considered as a pioneer and leader of Romanticism and one of the greatest poets in English literature. Some famous poems are such as Daffodils, Tintern Abbey, and The Prelude. Next, another famous Romanticism writers is George Gordon Byron, and we call them Lord Byron. And Byron is known one of the leading figures of Romantic movement in the early 19th centuries in England. Byron first achieved his fame with the publication of the narrative poem Childe Harold Pilgrim in 1812. And he's often described as most famous major romantics due to his life and his numerous love affairs. Many of his poems are connected to nature, and much of his work is pervaded by Byronic heroes, the character with great passion and talent, but sometimes the characters are arrogant and self-destructive. Byron is considered as the leading of the second generation of Romantic poet, and his famous poems are Don Juan published in 1824, She Walks in Beauty, published in 1813, and Childe Harold's Pilgrims, published in 1818. Next, we're going to talk about the modernism era of literature. The key point of modernism literature is that modernism as a literacy movement is typically associated with the period after World War I. So basically, compared to Romanticism, which is much more comedy and much more hopeful, modernism will be much more tragedy because it's like something that just happened. The writing are the expression of something that just happened after a war. So the post-war modernist literature reflects the sense of fragmentation. And there's a really famous writer called T.S. Eliot, and his writing is really fragmented. It's hard to understand, but he's really famous due to the depth of his writing, and his idea is really broad and really hard to really understand because we cannot feel his feeling from back then. But it's kind of a more negative writing, and a more, we can use the word of fragmentary to describe his work. He's a very famous modernist writer, and his work is usually the search for redemption and renewal in a spiritually empty landscape. With its fragmentary image of obscure and illusion, the poem is basically about, the modernism poems are basically about like the active role of interpreting the text. And some famous writers are basically, I already explained, T.S. Eliot and also Wallace Stevens. And I'll be explaining both of them also today. So for T.S. Eliot, he was born in 1888 to 19 and died in 1965. He's British, and Thomas Eliot is one of the key leader of modernism literature, and he's marked and his work becoming less iconic and focusing more on spiritual matters. Before his because it can be separated into two parts. In the earlier of his life, he's writing more of like romantic writings, but till the end, he become modernist poetry from 20th centuries. And his poets had lead to the idea of modernism. His poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is seen as a masterpiece of his writing life. In 1948, Eliot won Nobel Prize in literature of his outstanding pioneer contribution of the present day poetry. Regarded as one of the greatest figure in English literature, T.S. Eliot is the most famous modernist poet. And some of his famous poems that I believe everyone has read it before, such as The Wasted Land, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and also The Hollow Man. Next, I'll be talking about, last but not least, I'll be talking about Stevens. And Stevens is also American, and his major publication is written in the age of 35. However, he's famous until like his very late of his life. However, after his death, he has become one of the most significant, important American poet in the 20th century of modernist poetry. And many of his work are connect to something, the idea of philosophy, and his work, it's like also not easy to understand because some of it is connect to the idea of imaginations and some is connect to the idea of reality, but it's like the writings, it's very abstract. Instead, reality is the product of imagination as it shaped its own world. In 1955, the year of his death, Wallace Stevens won the Pulitzer Prize of Poetry for his poem. And some of his famous poems that I believe everyone have read it before are Sunday Morning, The Snowman, and The Emperor of Ice Cream, published in 1922. And thank you everybody for listening to my presentation today, and I hope you enjoy it. And this is basically the last week of the semester, and I hope you guys enjoy this course. Thank you so much. And all of my presentations are the work are founded from the textbook or from the class video lecture. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.